Avon Tyres, Image Wheels, Intermarque Silhouettes ventured to Donington Park for the prestigious Convoy in the Park meeting. Qualifying saw 21 cars take to the track in dry conditions, and the battle for pole position was between the Smith brothers of Lewis and Daniel, the latter snatching it by just 0.431 of a second. A really exciting qualifying session would see the two Mercedes line up on the front row together, with Daniel just ahead of Lewis. Ian Hales would finish in third position, just 0.6 of a second behind. Next would come Colin Smith in fourth position, followed by Russell Humphrey, Ruben Taylor and Keith White in seventh, the leading senior runner. He was ahead of his senior rival colleagues, Rich Smith and Phil Spinks. Next was Dave York, Scott Abrigliano, Philip Young, Paul Knight and Mick Robertson in 14th. Next came Lee Rogers. Fabio Lufarelli was in his Invitational class car in 16th. Next came John Price, Baz Johnson, Daniel Fisher, Philip Blackford and Stephen Phillips in 21st position in his Autocross Fiesta. Race 1 was late on Saturday afternoon on a track which was still drying out. Colin Smith was a non-starter due to an engine malfunction, and the live stream would follow the action showing Lewis Smith leading into the first few turns ahead of Daniel. Taylor had an incident which saw him stuck in the gravel down on the Craner curves, which brought out the safety car, which once again bunched the pack up whilst the Peugeot was being dragged to safety. The restart will see Lewis maintain the lead with a 1 second gap to his brother, with Hales running in a pretty lonely third position. Then the battle for fourth position was quite close, as White took the spot in the senior class from York, Knight and Humphreys. These four were only a few seconds apart come the end of the race. Lufarelli had charged through from the back of the field up into the 8th position, which was a great job from him in his Invitational class Volkswagen Corrado, with Lee Rogers in Brian Laram's Tigra driving very well to come home in 9th. And the top 10 would be completed by Scott Aprigliano, who was having a good race with Robertson, Young, Price and Johnson. But at the top it was a 1 second win for Lewis Smith. He'd be ahead of his brother Daniel, both in their Mercedes SLKs, just 1 second separating the top two after 10 laps of racing of Donington Park. Ian Hales would be next ahead of Keith White, Dave York and Paul Knight. Keith White being the leading senior runner ahead of Paul Knight in second. Russell Humphreys would be next in 7th ahead of Fabio Lufarelli in his Invitational class car. Then would come Lee Rogers in 9th, Scott Abrigliano, Mick Robertson, Philip Young, John Price, Baz Johnson and Stephen Phillips in 15th. Unfortunately, a few non-classified finishers, Phil Spinks, Richard Smith, Daniel Fisher, Philip Blackford and Ruben Taylor would not complete the race, but they had a second chance of redemption in the race coming up on Sunday morning. The Sunday race would once again be in interesting conditions as rain would start to fall once more. The top 7 were reversed for the second race of the day after the draw on Saturday afternoon. Humphreys would capitalise on his pole position, surging into the lead at turn 1. Knight just behind was having a few wobbles through the Craner curves, which inevitably led to some bunching up. Exiting the old hairpin, 3 cars went side by side, with Knight ending up on the grass and spinning into the gravel trap. Unfortunately, this would mean another safety car, and at the stage a lot was going on, with some cars starting on a mixture of wet and slick tyres, some on full wet. It was really making for an interesting decision about what would continue for the rest of this race. A couple dived into the pit lane to change tyres, and Hales was an early visitor after struggling to keep up in the conditions on the rolling start. Humphrey made a good restart, but Lewis was once again right on his tail. The white Mercedes took the lead on lap number 5 and started to gradually extend his lead all the way to the checkered flag. Humphrey maintained a second position to take the well-deserved runner-up spot, a fantastic drive for him in very, very tricky conditions. The battle for the final step on the podium was intense, with York just managing to hold off Daniel Smith and Spinks, who was initially classified in 5th after a strong drive from the back, but along with White they were eventually excluded. This would give the senior class win to a rather surprised Robertson. Taylor was promoted up into 5th position with Aprigliano in 6th. Next across the line was Rogers, but he was also excluded, meaning Lufarelli was classified in 7th. Hales was next, taking 8th place, followed by Fisher, Robertson and Price, and completing the finishers would be Smith, Johnson, Young and Phillips. So running through the order, after a very tricky race at Donington Park, after a couple of amendments, a couple of DNFs and a couple of disqualifications, the final order would be Lewis Smith winning by 3 seconds over Russell Humphrey, ahead of Dave York in 3rd position. Daniel Smith would finish in 4th position in his Mercedes SLK, ahead of Ruben Taylor in 5th position. Scott Aprigliano would be a strong 6th, ahead of Fabio Lufarelli in the Invitational Class car, ahead of Ian Hales, Daniel Fisher and Mick Robertson just ahead of John Price, the two of them battling for the Senior Class honours. They were ahead of Richard Smith, who was 12th, ahead of Baz Johnson, Philip Young, Stephen Phillips in 15th, and 2 DNFs, Paul Knight and Philip Blackford, and then 3 disqualifications, who were Keith White, Lee Rogers and Phil Spinks. Fastest laps would go to Lewis Smith in the overall, a 1:24.5, Fabio Lufarelli in the Invitational with a 1:27.4, and Mick Robertson a 1:30.5 in the Senior Class. The next racing for the Intermarque Silhouettes will be at Brands Hatch on the 16th of September. Be sure to join us then for another exciting round of action. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye.